So I am going to start analyzing an existing story by drawing pictures from that story. So I'm going to draw a picture with an element called a hole in the ground. And I'm going to add elements. The particulars of how the tool works are just specifics to the tool. They're not part of the drawing process. Look at the picture. Don't fret too much about how I'm drawing it with the tool. Look at the results. So, in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. And we know some things about this hole in the ground. Come on. We know that nasty is no, because it's not a nasty hole. It's not a wet hole. We also know it's not. Come on. We also know it's not a dry hole. Nor a sandy hole. We know that what it is comfort. And I goofed. I put here for initial value of, I put no. All right. So I have, okay, ignore where it says int in there. That's an artifact of the tool. Elements. Show property types, features, show property string. Yes, show string. I don't remember how to turn this one off right now. Come on. Let's see if that's it. Nope. All right. So ignore where it says :int for you programmers. Of course, that's saying that it's an integer. But this is the opening paragraph of The Hobbit. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms, nothing to sit on or nothing to eat, dry bears. I don't have it quite memorized. I'm pretty close. But it was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. So these are things we know from that opening paragraph. And slowly building from there, we're going to start to build a world. Do you all see my mute and stop video and security and so on tab here? It's right in the middle of my screen. I don't know if it's in the middle of what you see.
No, it's clear.
No. All right. So it's as long as it's not bothering you, because I can work around it. So now it tells us that it had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green. And so I go back to my class controls. I wish these were all on one tab, but they're not, for reasons that make perfect sense to a programmer. So it's a door, and the color is green, and the shape is round. And it has a door, which means the hole has the door. The arrow indicates the direction of having. We could easily not have an arrow on either end to say these two are connected, but neither can be considered having the other. Let's see here. How did I get ahead of page already? Shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. So knob which is shiny, in brass. And the door has the knob. Okay. At this point, I'm being silly to a degree. It is not going to matter later on in the story. If any of you have not read The Hobbit, no, it is not going to matter later on in the story that the knob was brass. It will actually matter for this chapter that the door was green. But it's going to take a beating, that door. But I am not going to need to know what the knob is, but I wanted to demonstrate the idea that a hole can have a door, can have a knob, and we can know things about them which might or might not be useful in the future. I am right now analyzing this story, and I'm trying desperately to pretend that I know nothing about a book that I've read 23 times. So sometimes my future knowledge is going to kind of run into these diagrams, but I'm going to try to keep it to a minimum. If I am approaching a story, because I've done this for a few clients where they ask me to look at their story and try to do the model for them, to try to analyze and raise questions about the story. And so when I approach a story like this, I am literally approaching it with no concept of what's going to be significant in the future. I know for a fact that Bilbo's doorknob is, I'm sorry, we don't know his name yet, that the Hobbit's holes, doors, doorknob being brass is not going to be a significant story element down the road. But early on in analyzing a story, I really don't know yet what is going to be significant. And I would rather overanalyze than underanalyze, because the analysis becomes a way of diving into the story in a different way from reading it. When I taught software development, I called this the outline effect. When you have knowledge and you listen to it or read it, that involves one path through your brain. When you make something with it, that involves other paths through your brain. And therefore, you are thinking about it differently and more deeply. When I am creating this picture, I am taking the words in, I am trying to understand relationships among them, and then I'm even trying to involve the visual elements of my brain, which is why the book Making Story Models is about visualizing stories. I'm taking those visual parts of my brain and involving them in the analysis. And I'm even, to a degree, involving motor skills, the motor elements of the brain, because I have to move things around to draw the picture. And eventually, I will start organizing things, trying to say, I want to get a pleasing shape. And I think that maybe since the doorknob kind of isn't important, I'll move it someplace where it's out of the way, but I can come back to it later. Shaping these pictures, rearranging them until they're beautiful pictures that I want to share with the world, is also almost a form of meditation on their content. What's the important parts here that I have to emphasize? Are there parts that maybe I eventually pull the doorknob off this diagram entirely because it proves not to be meaningful? So that whole process of arranging is what I call the hotel room part of the process. Because back when I was modeling software systems for clients, I would go to a strange city, and they don't come stranger than Ann Arbor, go to meet with a client, spend all day modeling with them, and at the end of the day, they would go home to their family and friends and their activities and whatnot, and I would go back to my hotel room because Ann Arbor's a bad example here. I've got 100 friends in Ann Arbor, but in general, I'm in a strange city by myself. So I've got nothing better to do at night in the hotel room than make the pictures pretty for tomorrow. And in the process, I get a whole second phase of learning. Arranging the pictures to make sense requires me to think about what makes sense within those pictures. So the door opened onto a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel. Okay. I think the hall is probably going to be important. coming off of the hole. A very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with paneled walls and floors tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The Hobbit was fond of visitors. Okay, I could try to draw all of that, but at some point it becomes easier, especially with a $229 tool, to use text as text. Notice how Kindle cleverly includes the credit for it so that I can go back to say, where did I get this text from? That wasn't Enterprise Architect doing that. That's just Kindle makes sure that when you copy and paste, they include a credit line. The tunnel wound on and on. All right, I've got to hide this thing somehow. The bar is in my way now. Let me try taking it all the way to the top of the page. Okay. Tunnel wound on and on, going fairly, but not quite straight into the side of the hill. The hill, as people for many miles around called it. So we have another place, which is the hill. And the hill has the hole in the ground. And many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side and then on another. No going upstairs to the Hobbit. Blah, blah. Okay, this much text. I'm not drawing a map of the Hobbit's home yet. Maybe we will do it later. This Hobbit was a very well-to-do Hobbit, and his name was Baggins. Okay, now I can go back to my picture here and introduce a small bit of notation. And by the way, this is a bit of notation that my book, Making Story Models, never gets into. Not that the book is incomplete, but the book captures the simplest paths as opposed to what I might necessarily do in a real practice of analyzing or modeling. So you're seeing things that aren't in my book, which doesn't mean I'm not proud of it, just means that it can't capture everything I do. The concept here is what we programmers would call a class. Wait, before I do this, let's go back over here and show you my browser model of my model. Over here, as I'm drawing things, you see that they're all getting added over here. That we have a Hobbit, we have a hole in the ground, nasty, wet, dry, sandy, comfort, door, and so on. And notice that the Hobbit has got a shape here, and it's just called Hobbit. Now I'm going to go and do something here, which is I'm going to change it into an instance. Sorry, time to do some geek speak here. In fact, I'm going to do geek speak on top of geek speak. If I go over here now and look, we see we have Hobbit and we have :Hobbit. Hobbit now is what in programmer terms we would call a class. More generic synonyms in English would be a type or a kind. To say hobbits are a kind of creature, and this particular hobbit, they told us, is called Baggins. Only I am going to sneak in a little foreknowledge here that I know he's Bilbo Baggins, and I don't want to have to change the name twice. So now this Bilbo Baggins :Hobbit tells us that Bilbo Baggins is a specific hobbit that lives in this hole in the ground. The Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the hill for time out of mind, blah, 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 blah. You could tell what a Baggins would say. This is a story of how a Baggins had an adventure and found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected, blah, 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 foreshadowing up the wazoo. The mother of our particular hobbit, and then he goes off into the finally 3 pages in saying, oh, you don't know what a hobbit is. I suppose some hobbits need some description these days. And now here's where I once again am way too lazy to try to draw this as a picture, because some things just are easier in text. And so now I go and say, we have our, over here, over here we have Hobbit as the class, the category, and I want to open up the properties and say that here's what we know about hobbits. So I've just captured some knowledge in there that way. All the things about a hobbit. And then, as I was saying, the mother of this hobbit, of Bilbo Baggins, that is, was the famous Belladonna Took. So now what I do is I drag Hobbit onto this page again. And notice that I've just got an artifact in here. Because originally I drew a hobbit as having a line to a hole in the ground. And then I said, no, Bilbo has the line to the hole in the ground, but all of a sudden Hobbit has a line to the hole in the ground. That's just a process of the way I drew it. But you know, there are things called erasers, or in this case, delete keys. And I say, I'm going to delete that. Not all hobbits live in the hole in the ground. Bilbo lives in the hole in the ground, but not all hobbits live in the ground. And then I'm going to say that that hobbit I dragged onto there is also an instance of a hobbit. It is not hobbits in general. It is a specific hobbit, Belladonna Took. And we can argue which way this arrow has to go, whether it's from mother to son or son to mother. I am going to put it from son to mother because I, sneaking ahead, know that Bilbo is the protagonist and Belladonna will never show up in the story again. So I'm going to go in here and say that Belladonna Took, we are going to call the mother. And so you see that it added that label onto the arrow, onto the end of the arrow. I'm going to get lazy in the future and I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this where I can just double click and just type in the name. No, that was the diagram. And so I can type in some sort of name like the main hall. It's faster, it's lazy, but I'm all about being lazy if it helps get things done. The only minor difference is look at where the label mother is on this one, right next to the mother. So we know who it's applying to. With this one, it's in the middle. So you could have an argument over which is the main hall. I'm not going to have that argument. I'm going to know. And it's so many more steps to put the label on the end. So that was Belladonna Took, one of the three remarkable daughters of the Old Hook. Old Took. Come on, browser. So we need a hobbit called the Old Took. So make that an instance. Yes. Come on. Clicking the wrong things. The Old Took. And he, come on, is her father. Head of the hobbits who lived across the water, the small river that ran at the foot of the hill. So now we have the water that runs at the foot of the hill. It was often said, blah, 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 Took ancestors must have had a fairy wife, blah, blah, blah. Not that Belladonna Took ever had any adventures after she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins. Bungo, that was Bilbo's father. Okay, we are getting a lot of hobbits on here. And if I had read this book before, I might know that Bungo also is never going to appear in this story after this line. Well, okay, after this paragraph or so. And I will draw a connection there. And sometimes I get lazy and in a hurry, so I don't bother labeling the connections and figure I'll remember them later. And sometimes I then have to laugh at myself because I don't. But I'm trying to give a useful example here, not get the entire family tree. But later on, I'm going to get a family tree or two where I'm going to take these elements and turn them into family trees and start asking questions. Okay. Under the hill, across the water, blah, 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 blah. More description of Bilbo that if I really wanted to, I could paste into the model in the text box. So by some curious chance, when there was less noise in my green, Bilbo was standing at his door after breakfast, smoking an enormous long wooden pipe that reached nearly down to his woolly toes, neatly brushed. I'm not going to put the pipe in the picture because I just don't think it's important, and I will turn out to be right. And Gandalf came by. And right now, you know, if I had read this book before, I would draw a picture of a wizard coming by and call him Gandalf. So wizard would be the class and Gandalf would be the instance. But right now, they haven't told me that much. So I'm going to have Gandalf come by. And then it has a bunch of descriptions about Gandalf and how famous he is and where he's been and blah, 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 blah. Bilbo saw that morning was an old man with a staff. Okay. Something, just some instinct tells me that that staff is important. It's one of the very first things we learn about Gandalf is he has a staff. So I don't know, maybe he throws it away in the next scene, but I think I'm going to capture that staff. He had a tall, pointed blue hat, a long gray cloak, a silver scarf over which his long white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black boots. I tend not to draw pictures of clothing. I tend to paste them in for description, maybe. Bilbo says, "Good morning," and he meant it. Gandalf immediately becomes a jerk, questioning what he said. Bilbo tries to be pleasant, smokes some smoke rings, and Gandalf is once again saying, "Hey, gee, that's all pretty. I don't care. I have something more important to do. I'm looking for someone to share in an adventure." Now we have a goal. This diagram is getting messy fast. Again, when I get back to the hotel room, I will rearrange it into a pretty diagram. But find someone for adventure. Gandalf has a goal now. I will contend, tools not rules, feel free to come up with counterexamples, but I will contend that you don't have a story until you have goals. You have reasons why the characters are stepping out of where we find them in the first place. So, little quick reminders on notations. So we have boxes, which are things and places. We have stick figures, which are characters. We have big bubbles, which are goals. They are also actions that characters take in pursuit of those goals. They can also be reasons why they have those goals, motivations behind them. For now, the only one we have is a goal. This will get sometimes into really odd situations, such as is a robot a character or an object? And the answer is yes, because again, if you know me for a while, if you ever ask me A or B, I will always answer yes or C. So yes, a robot is an object, which is also a character, depending entirely on how you're working in the story. All right. So Gandalf wants someone to share in this adventure, and it's difficult to find anyone. Bilbo basically explains to him why he thinks this is a really bad idea, and he starts to try to ignore this strange man. So Bilbo's goal is ignore Gandalf. Some of these things are definitely getting in the way. All right, so he's trying to ignore Gandalf, but Gandalf is having nothing to do with it. Bilbo says, "Good morning, we don't want any. Try to move over the hill." Gandalf says, "Okay, now you want to get rid of me." And Bilbo says, "No, no, no." Gandalf introduces himself, and now Bilbo's like, "Oh, wait, I recognize you. I've met you before." He didn't know it until this moment, but they do have some past connection. He gave the old Took a pair of magic diamond studs, so Gandalf has in the past been associated with the old Took. Wonderful tales. Old Took used to have them. I won't bother putting the diamond studs onto the picture. You'll notice already that Mr. Baggins was not quite so prosy as he liked to be and fond of flowers. Blah, 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 blah. Had no idea you were still in business. Where else should I be? And that is not without, indeed, for your old grandfather Took's sake and for the sake of poor Belladonna. So Gandalf also has known Belladonna. Kind of makes sense if he knew the grandfather and he knew the grandson, he would be knowing the daughter in between. Going to take your leave, and is also going to send him on this adventure. Which means now ignoring Gandalf doesn't work. So I'm going to do a little special notation on this. This is unique to me. You aren't going to find this on traditional UML books. UML, for those of you who aren't programmers, Unified Modeling Language. It's essentially a blueprint notation for software. And I am going to add on a minus sign. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to see it, but if you look really close, you can see the minus sign in there. The minus sign means this goal hinders this goal. So when you start seeing conflicting goals, more story starts emerging. So Gandalf's goal of finding someone for the adventure is conflicting with Bilbo's goal of ignoring Gandalf, because Bilbo has actually a real motivation, which is he likes his quiet life. And I'm going to use a special different arrow for that one. For you programmers, think of it as inheritance. UML calls it generalization, which means that liking his quiet life is the general principle. It's the motivation. It's the thing behind the scenes. Ignoring Gandalf is one part of liking his quiet life. Now, a note about the different arrows I'm using. If you can figure out my arrows, that's not a problem. I got to tell you, I've been modeling with some people for 20 years, and we still argue sometimes about the right arrow for a situation. And that argument turns into a conversation, and we both know more when we're done. So if you don't keep track of these different kinds of arrows and you just draw one kind of arrow for everything, I'm not going to tell you you're doing it wrong. But when I use a specific arrow, I'm going to explain why I thought that was important. And this is, as you'll see in my book, this is my general way of showing a goal and a motivation behind the goal. The triangle-headed arrow says, this is why he's ignoring Gandalf, because Bilbo likes a quiet life. Boy, I have this suspicion that Bilbo's not going to get a quiet life, since this is still chapter 1 of a moderately long book. All right. So he says, I'm going to send you on this. Very amusing, very good and profitable if you get over it. Bilbo says, don't want any. Please come to tea. Why not tomorrow? Come tomorrow. Goodbye. And so now here, Bilbo has an action, which is an invitation to tea. It's not a goal so much as a thing he does, and he does it as part of trying to ignore Gandalf. So actually, if I were doing this for my own work, I'd introduce yet another new arrow, which is the dashed arrow and the include, which says ignoring Gandalf includes inviting him to tea. I got to tell you, Bilbo ain't that bright. If you want to invite someone, if you want to ignore someone, inviting them back to your house, it could go wrong. But there's the invitation to Bilbo. Now, it actually, give Tolkien credit for it. Afterwards, he says, why did I ask him to tea? He'd only just had breakfast. And so he's like, why did I do this? I was that desperate to get away. And he shut it as quickly as he dared, not to seem rude. Wizards, after all, are wizards. Now, I think we've actually seen it earlier, but now we do know that Gandalf is in fact a wizard. So let us turn Gandalf into an instance. Go over here to our browser. And now we see that we have two Gandalfs. We have Gandalf and we have Gandalf the class. And I'm going to change that one to be wizard. And so now this says, hey, he's a wizard. And I say yes, and his name is Gandalf. Not Gandalf, Gandalf. And so we have the first scene out of the way. We have a somewhat messy diagram of everything we've learned in that scene, or the biggest things we've learned in this scene, and some of the things are inside as well. Any questions on the process I followed to this point? No questions? You can also put them in chat. No chat. All right.